of our faces at once. I know sometimes it's a challenge on Zoom, so we figured we'd make it a bit easier. But hello everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today for this presentation on a silvicultural outcome study that we've been working on. My name is Rowan Braybrook, and I'm the Director of Programs at Northwest Natural Resource Group in the Puget Sound area. Wanted to give a quick introduction to my colleagues that are on the line, and then they can also go into a little bit more depth on their experience and interests during their presentations. Klaus is a silviculture professor at OSU, and today he's coming to us from Smurfville, also known as Corvallis, where everything is blue. And then we have Seth, who is the Executive Director of Northwest Natural Resource Group. We both work at the nonprofit, and that we focus on ecological forestry. And Seth is coming to us from an undisclosed location in Seattle. And finally, we have Sarah, who is a data scientist over at EcoTrust, and she's beaming in from Portland today. So we're all really excited to have you here and kick off this discussion on some of the very preliminary results of a study that we've been doing. I wanted to give you just a quick introduction of the study that we've been doing and kind of what the reasons were for doing it, and then we'll kick off into the presentations proper. So we've been gathering data for the last a little bit over a year. And have managed to get data from about 78 harvests in Western Washington and Western Oregon, spanning the time period of 2014 to 2020. So essentially harvests within the last 5 or 6 years. And the study that we've been conducting has over 100 questions, getting into a lot of details about individual harvests. So that's covering everything from the harvest unit's topography and what the stand composition is before and after a harvest, to hauling distance and gross income. Probably there are a couple of people on the call who have taken the study, and if so, thanks so much for sticking with it. I know it was a lot of questions, but we wanted to make sure that we got into a lot of depth about kind of the economics of thinning and what are the factors that really influence the outcomes of different types of harvests. So what we were really getting at with this study was focusing on comparing the results of thinning and uneven age management to other types of management, and really looking to create some better information about management options, because we know that with better information, that makes the decision-making process about how to manage land and what types of prescriptions to use in different harvests a lot easier for landowners of all different types. So today we have 3 presentations and 2 Q&A sessions broken up so we can keep everyone hopefully interested and engaged with all of the different information we have to present. We're going to start out with Klaus talking a bit about kind of the broader context of his silvicultural research, and we'll have option for Q&A right after his presentation. You're welcome to drop questions in the chat, and I'll be monitoring that. Or once we hit the Q&A, you can also come in on video, and we'd be happy to chat with you directly. And then we have 2 other presentations. One, Sarah is going to give an early sneak peek into the data that we've gathered and start going through what some of that data is telling us. And then Seth is going to share some of the case studies from that data and really pick out some of the individual stories that are being told with that data. And then we'll have another Q&A session. So without further ado, I'd love to pass it over to Klaus and hear more what he has to say.
Thank you for the introduction. So first I should mention I have to leave early. We have a promotion and tenure decision meeting afterwards, and that takes priority on that. People don't want to wait a year because I have meetings. So you'll see here I labeled this presentation Managing for a Balanced Set of Ecosystem Services. And while I have the professorship in silviculture alternatives, the Edmund Hayes professorship, That's really focused on, at the time, the alternatives to industrial type management on that. And to me, it's just a little bit more, and it's tough for me to define it in a better way. You know, being the alternative is kind of, well, the second child, so to speak. And we're really looking at how we can make forestry work that provides a set of ecological, social, and economical benefits at the same time on that. So I grew up in Germany, just very briefly, and in a forestry setting. My family has some forestry land, had for a few hundred years. And the picture on the left is actually from the US, but if it would have been on my parents' land, there would be nothing underneath. I grew up in a setting that was about as traditional in terms of forestry operations as you can find in a truly classical sense. I could never plant straight enough in terms of rows for my father, etc. It's very classical way. So over time, I've moved to the right here and worked with the all diverse stand structures with this balanced set of ecosystem service goal. And some of my friends say I'm still rebelling against my childhood or my upbringing in that sense. So I'm going to highlight a few examples here. This old growth seasoning example is information we found from our research studies. A lot of those studies were dealing with older plantations and converting them into more different structural, late successional habitat features. But there is a lot more to it, of course. And especially I'll mention briefly, you know, the starting conditions we drive of what you can do. So it is really about, to me, thinking about what kind of conditions provide us a different set of ecosystem services. We know how to do it when we focus on timber only, and we know how to focus when we focus on conservation only. And that middle ground, to me, is where the research is needed, and this is part of it. So when I look at that, what are some of the main criteria? I'm simplifying a little bit, but one of the things that comes into play is really variability, diversity, and diversity at multiple scales as an important feature on that. So when we talk about stands on that, if you want multiple ecosystem services, some kind of balance, you probably need some variability, some heterogeneity inside the stand to get all that. If everything is homogeneous, if every tree is the same age, size, quality, quite likely you can't find a balanced set, or at least a diverse set. It doesn't have to be balanced, per se, I guess. And so that brings me to the point when we talk about managing, the starting conditions will drive a lot of what you can do on that. So you'll see if you start with a 60-year-old, even-aged, fully stocked Douglas fir plantation, you can do a lot of things and make money. You can just do about anything, and you're still going to make money as long as you cut trees and sell them. If you start out with a abandoned grass field that still has opening in it, that has a lot of maple in it, oak in it, maybe a few Douglas fir, or maybe not, you have obviously a whole different set of options on that. And so we want to think about managing, if you manage for a set of ecosystem services, that variability is key. And we'll talk about how to be smart about variability within a stand. So at small, very small scales, from planned neighborhoods to within the landscape and the ownership. So if every stand looks exactly the same as your neighboring stand, even though the stand itself may be variable, you're also going to miss out on some aspects of the provision of ecosystem services. And again, thinking about the starting conditions on that, to go about that, one of the key features I'm pushing in my program is really, rather than fighting natural trends, stepping back, clicking everything, homogenizing everything, is dealing with the variability as an opportunity. And so if you have, for example, if you have some planting failure, some seedling mortality, you can go back, spray it again, plant it again, and get everything homogeneous. Or you may take advantage of those pockets here and there as biodiversity hotspots where you let other vegetation grow and therefore provide a different ecosystem service in the process. So thinking about natural dynamics and thinking about taking advantage of them, supporting them, taking advantage of them, rather than fighting it. So you can look at it as almost like a bottom-up versus top-down approach to management. So when we talk about variability on that, you see here the Forest Service has a bunch of well, examples in there with the FES system. And I mean variability in multiple ways. You're looking at different species here, the darker one being the conifers, actually some hemlock in there. There should be some hardwoods in there. That obviously comes into play. You have variability in terms of tree sizes. You can see the height distribution here on the left, separated by species, and crowns, I guess, as well. And then you have spatial variability, and that's depicted up in the upper right corner here, where you have open pods in there that are more open. You have a few big trees, maybe even clustered together. And then you have pockets of regeneration on that. And all of these are important for that type of management that provides that balanced set of ecosystem services. And again, I guess I want to point out the starting conditions, what you start out with in terms of variability, but also, of course, in terms of the physical nature of what's there and what's marketable and what needs attention in terms of management will drive your conditions. So I'll just highlight a few examples on that kind of show this starting conditions. This is part of the BLM pilot project that Jerry Franklin and Norm Johnson pushed through. Actually, they call it the secretarial private project. It came from above the BLM on that, where they went into plantations that were established in the 1960s, 1970s. And then you can see here, they did not clear cut the full plantation. They left residuals in the middle as the riparian protection, but also in between. The edges are feathered on that, and this is their way of increasing the variability. You'd see there'll be some darker spots where we get regeneration, maybe of shade-tolerant species. And then, of course, these open spots here, Douglas fir will grow like it grows in a clear-cut kind of setting. So other examples of entering fully stocked plantation on the left, one of our experiments on the Willamette National Forest. On that, we had 4 reps. 2 of them are burned up by now, one of them in the Cougar fire, and one of them, I think I haven't been able to get to it. The road is still blocked, but it's up on the Mackenzie. So this rep is still standing at Christie Flat, and you see, among others, we cut gaps into these dense forests on that, and gaps big enough that we can grow Douglas fir, and it grows very efficiently on there. So a fairly simplistic way, we didn't go fancy, we just put quarter-acre gaps or half-acre gaps, and it actually had a regular spacing. That was the early 1990s. That was something new, and we had enough issues putting those through, and we could not convince the foresters not to plant. I was hoping for more variability, natural regeneration, allow the shrubs to be a component in those gaps, but at the time, forestry meant regeneration, and regeneration meant planting. On the right side, you see actually is an operation we had on McDonald Forest a few years ago. It's a plantation that was about almost 30 years old. And what you see here, we went in and looked at all those few hardwoods that were surviving. On the top here, you can see that's not a dead fir, that's a cherry that was here. And so we made a point where we protected all the hardwoods, and we thinned heavier around those hardwoods to make sure they stick around and stick around for longer. And so that meant most of the operation was just a standard thinning operation, but where we found the hardwoods, the cherry, the occasional maple, the very occasional oak, we just switched trigger and protected those. So those operations, both of them are fairly easy operationally to implement on that. So not particularly cost effective, expensive, but operationally for the operator and the marker is easy to do. If you have different starting conditions, you may end up with a different story. On the left up here, you see this photo is of the stand near the Corvallis watershed, so just west of Corvallis on that. And there was a somewhat fully stocked stand, but the Columbus Day storm knocked a bunch of holes in it. And then those holes in some ownerships naturally regenerated, and other ownerships even they ended up planting, but they salvaged and then replanted the gaps in that. And so by now, I guess 61, so almost 60 years later, you have these different ages of trees growing in a spatially diverse patterns driven by the storm itself. So again, a natural trend that happened there. They, rather than homogenizing the stand, starting over again, utilizing that natural dynamic to diversify the stand structure. And now, of course, the important challenge is to keep managing that stand to maintain that structure over time as those gaps are closing in. So I kind of jokingly say we need the Columbus Day storm. The foresters are reluctant to make some of these openings, so maybe another Columbus Day storm will help us in that and maintain that. I think you get the idea. On the right side, you see another setting. You may know Xena Forest, just a little bit east of Salem. They are on drier sites, and for them, the hardwoods are not just the occasional hardwood that is left in a Douglas fir-dominated world, like I showed before, and structure is not just where it happened to be with the Columbus Day storm. They're working on an integrated setting where hardwoods, in most cases here oaks, you can see are an important part of their management objective that they manage with, and having multiple canopy layers, a diverse structure, and especially diverse spread of those structures is part of their management regime as well. So you can see here on that they have fully integrated this idea of spatial diversity composition in terms of species, tree species diversity and structural diversity, and that's an inherent part. So their starting conditions were different, and on many places they are already in that mode that some of the other examples I showed are moving towards. So I'm not sure we need to go through all the details. What I want to highlight here is some of our research found when we looked at, we measured a number of characteristics. So from the crown length, tree sizes, canopy layers, shrub cover, exotic species cover, snags. And on the timeline, you see this was the pre-harvest conditions, so a 55-year-old dense, very well-growing Douglas fir plantation. And then we had our restoration treatments, and I'll show some example what that looked like. And what I want to really highlight here is that the different structural components respond individually. It's not all in sync. For one thing, the elevation here shows some of them are more dynamic than others. In terms of the crown length, that crown lift, in the lower branches die, that stopped basically the day the neighbor trees were cut. And so that was a very the tree size in terms of diameter started growing pretty quickly. Canopy layers and crown canopy layers was a little slower. When we looked at some of the water usage, there's a 4 or 5 year adjustment period for Douglas fir. So the new layers. And then the other ones are slow, and I want to even show the snags down here at the bottom. Initially, we had some mortality in snags, but all the trees we removed are potential future missing snags. So compared to an unmanaged forest, I should say, not compared to managed forest, we may actually have a fewer snags, but of course we hope that those snags in the future are bigger. So think about that. If you're interested in, providing some habitat, some structural diversity, it pays attention to what specifically am I interested in, and different aspects respond at different speed and maybe even different directions on that. So what helps with multiple canopy layers, or even shaping the crown, getting that more old growth type crown, hurts you with snags and the other way. So it's not a one size fits all story. So how can we deal with that in a managed operation on that? And here is how we dealt with that in our experiments. And actually you can see here, this is one of the experimental sites on BLM land here. And if you see a lot of variability there, that's because we designed it. There are multiple treatments in there. I just highlighted one treatment here, and I'll show you where different aspects of different processes are encouraged in different parts of the treatment area. So for one thing, the red one, the whole area showed increased seedling establishment. So anytime we went in and thinned, regardless how dense, how much we thinned or not, that soil disturbance and that opening up of the canopy, we got more seedlings germinating. The yellow area here, those are a few gaps where we cut in. That's where we really saw improved and increased seedling growth on that. And that's where we also saw the early successional vegetation in this setting. So we got in the red one, we got germination, but they don't grow very well because we got a fairly dense canopy on that. So we had to open things up a lot more, making gaps. Then we got that growth, especially Douglas fir growth, obviously. And that's when we saw the change also in vegetation composition. So if you want to, it seems to be clear, if you want to make drastic changes, you can't be subtle on that. If you want to change from late successional to early successional, we have to open things up. And here we had a quarter, half, and 1 acre gap, and it was very clear the 1 acre gap was way more successful at achieving these conditions. In terms of tree growth, here, I guess this is the little faded area here. Those were stands that we had optimal conditions for tree growth, the classic standard thinning operation on that. And so that's where we saw improved tree growth. But it was important to know when you look in detail about which tree responds after you thin, it's really not the big trees that respond, it's actually the smaller one that you leave behind. So tree growth raised our average diameter increment, and actually our basal area almost grew at the same rate pretty soon after the harvesting operation than it did before. But the main benefit was that the slower growing trees, the trees that grew slow before the entry, were the ones that got the most benefit. The green spots here, you can see are leaf islands. I pointed out before that snags may actually follow a different trend after our treatments. So we wanted to make sure we have snags and downed wood there. And on the rest of the land, we would discourage it in the long run. So we put some snag downed wood hotspots in it and left either, I guess, quarter, half, and 1 acre patches alone as skips that we didn't treat at all. And that's where we see the mortality. And that's where the snags are provided. The last down here, and at the bottom, the orange here, orange and black, no coincidence there. Those are the rings, the edges of the gaps in this kind of setting, and one area here where we thinned down to about 20 trees per acre. And those ones we did because we learned that standard thinning operation, the business as usual thinning, did not really benefit the fastest growing trees on that. They already were growing fast, so thinning around them, they didn't really see that much of a difference. And if you're interested in, well, old growth like our habitat as we were in this, it's those big trees that kick you into the old growth category, right? Those are the ones that define old growth, so the trees over 40 inches, etc. So we need to especially open things up and really clear at least half of the area around them, larger scale with a gap or in a leaf island. So this is just one example how we try to accommodate by the different responses of different habitat structures by spatial layout that specializes a little bit. And so we do that within a stand like here, and we can do that also within a landscape. So that's kind of just a few highlights of stuff that I've learned over the years, how we can manage with that. And now you can see why I got interested in how that operationally works, because as we all know, if it doesn't pay for itself, it doesn't happen over the long run on a larger scale. So I'll stop right there, and maybe I'll leave that slide up and can open it up for questions, right? Well,
absolutely. Thanks, Klaus. So if anyone has questions, you're welcome to either put them in the chat box, or we can unmute you if you let us know that you'd like to speak. Just to kick things off and maybe give people a minute or two to type up their questions. Klaus, how are you hoping that some of the things that we're studying right now in the thinning study and silvicultural outcomes study will help complement this research and information that you just presented?
Yeah, a lot of my research and the early work in the 90s in this, it was on federal land. And when you see this area here has 4 different treatments in it, and we could not separate the economics of one treatment of the other on that. And you can see here there are different buffer width and different spacings and all that stuff intermixed. So, and the big question to me, as I hinted before, is if you want to do this in the landscape, we need to have the economic numbers, and that's the stuff that is really missing, at least from our work. So, and again, actually, I was really interested in seeing what are people already doing out there. I'm sitting in the ivory tower, and that I think obviously as I drive around and walk around, bike around, I see a lot of areas that look like somebody's really trying an innovative approach, but it's tough for me to get the overview, so I'm hoping this study would help with that as well.
Great. And I think at most you're in a wooden tower rather than an ivory tower. So
That's the new building.
a little bit closer to the wood.
The new PV is the wooden.
We did have a question from Lynn. Do you have studies currently for tree growth success with climate change anticipation?
Not directly. We have actually the last study I'm working on. We're just trying to finalize the write-up. Is where we looked at specifically the impact of water and drought stress. And for that one, we kind of matched sites on the Willamette National Forest and the BLM land on Roseburg, with the idea that how trees respond to drought in Roseburg may be an indication what will happen in the Willamette in the future on that setting. So we're looking at those things, the various aspects, but that's a very tough one to study in the field unless they allow us to put huge greenhouses over part of the forest. But clearly that's something that needs to happen because all of these relationships that, the planned interactions will be influenced by the climate, and not just the climate, but the slow creep in temperature, but by the associated disturbances on that. So actually one paper I've been working on the last couple of days is we need to start think how to manage with extreme events in mind. That these extreme events that lead to the problem we just see, we can ignore them for a while, but eventually they catch up, and so we need to start thinking about how we manage knowing that those will happen. And some of the messages are very similar, how the diversity of within stand and across stand or landscape conditions helps break that, that movement of diseases that go across the landscape, that break up the fire. We know that already with fire breaks, that help out with wind, etc. So I think we can learn a lot from looking at these studies to help us prepare for the climate change as well. But I need more research money to do that more.
If there are any foundations or government institutions on the call, there you go. Yeah, so if anyone else has questions, you can put them in the chat box because as Klaus mentioned, he will have to drop off at 2. If we did have 2 more, one from Sustainable Northwest. What kind of response did you see from the large diameter trees? I recall a lot of the motivation for thinning younger stands comes from wanting to catch younger trees while they're still responsive to changes in resources.
Yeah, actually that's a good point. Douglas fir seems to be able, at least Douglas fir, I'm sticking with that, seems to be able to respond even at older ages on that, even at 120 years. And there's one study on drier land that one of John Tappan's students, Peggy Latham, did years ago, where she went into a 324-year-old, something like that, maybe a year or two off. They went and they thinned around a 320-year-old Douglas fir, and they could still see the response of that tree. So other species don't have that same responses in the older ages. So with Douglas fir, clearly the earlier the better, especially if you want to maintain a deep crown on that. It's tough to recover that. But in terms of growth response, even an 80 and 100-year-old, and there are some data coming out actually from also the BlackRock study. But that's one species that can respond even at older ages. So it's never too late for them, it seems to be.
Hopefully never too late for any of us. And we had a question from Jacqueline as well. Do you have any studies taking place on the mycorrhizal networks within your projects?
No, I guess they looked at that with the demo studies a little bit here. I am obviously in communication with Suzanne Simard, who has made that her major focus of a research program at UBC. Actually, we were students together, so there's a long-term connection. But no, we did not look at that. And I've got to be careful here. I got the impression from what I saw in the demo study that the mycorrhizal network can maintain itself quite well after partial harvest. And the clay cut is a little separate, so it doesn't take every tree. Obviously, there's some adjustment. There is some, but if you think about that, mycorrhizae connect multiple trees together. That's why they become the network, right? And the evolutionary advantage is if one tree dies, it can tap into the other tree. So in that sense, I think that's probably one of the reasons why we may not see a drastic response in mycorrhizae. But again, I'm no expert on that. I gotta be careful.
Yeah, it's a whole separate, well, not separate, but deep study of research that has a lot going on right now. And Seth asked, is it hard to find operators to carry out these intricate and complicated prescriptions, such as the one on the last slide?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that was a research one where we kind of laid things out up front, but I've worked quite a bit, and actually when we did some follow-up harvesting on that, we brought in the loggers into some of the decision. So one thing you'll see here, for example, the gaps here, I don't know if you see the mouse and follow that. Oops, of course now I lose it. The gaps here are in a line down the hill. And that's to facilitate a cable logging, so that the tower was up here, and with one cable layout, they tap into 5 gaps here. And so we did bring the logging decision into that. And what I've seen from various operations, if that's done smoothly, that really makes things simpler. You know, for one thing, to create a gap, we take one GPS location measurement, and that's all we need. And loggers can work with that and put a 60-foot gap in, or 100-foot gap in. And so, like we did, for example, in the follow-up, we created snags and downed wood, and we kind of did that. They were marked with a simple operation where twice a day at 11 o'clock and at 3 o'clock, the alarm went off, and the markers marked 10 trees as downed wood or snags in the area where they were there at the time. And so that was a very efficient way. They didn't have to pay attention to the working thing. We figured when we did the assessment, we have one of those patches every 4 or 5 acres. So we got some spatial variability, and there's no regular pattern depending on the market pattern. And we basically could market, at least in that sense, without any additional cost. So there's a lot to be done. Loggers get quite efficient now with GIS, GPS on those. At least I've seen some operations on the Willamette where I'm just blown away. I use it in my class, but the amount of diversity that people could bring in a very efficient logging operation. But of course, it takes more effort. It takes more effort in the planning. And, even if planning is whatever, 25% more expensive, planning is 2 to 5% of the harvesting cost. So that's something to keep in mind. But clearly, the harvesting, I should say, it makes a big difference whether you're going to be cable logging here and ground logging. But even here, actually, I was amazed. I don't have the exact numbers for the harvesting cost, but aligning the gaps made a big difference. Certainly the loggers were really happy about that. Efficient way to do it. Plus, they knew they would get some big trees in their mix as well by cutting the gaps open, including the biggest trees in these gaps.
And we did have one other question come in from Lynn. After fires, will there be an attempt to replant or add additional forests to your studies? So I think that's oriented toward your studies at LSU, Klaus, rather than the thinning study.
We'll have to, I guess I would like to get in and see what actually happened and whether we can see a burn pattern that reflects our previous treatments at that scale, whether we actually see that, those gaps where we had younger seedlings burn different and therefore impacted or are not impacted the neighboring stands and stuff. So this will be a bigger group, obviously, with the Forest Service where we have to talk, and BLM, where we have to talk about that. In fact, I just got an email 10 minutes before the talk here that the BLM is trying to get a group together to think about what to do with their land that burned. And I think that discussion will kind of feature a little bit how we can take advantage of our experiments and providing information. So I don't know yet.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your presentation. I think at this point we'll move on to Sarah's presentation on some of the data that we found during, specifically during this economics of thinning or silvicultural outcome study that we've been discussing. So we are going to look at some of the preliminary results that she's been analyzing, and then right after that go into Seth sharing some of the specific case studies, and then we'll have another opportunity for Q&A. So Sarah, I will turn it over to you. And Sarah, I think you might still be muted.
Sorry about that. Let me get this right here. Okay, starting my video, sharing my screen. All right. Am I on screen? And
yes, we can see preliminary results.
Okay. So thanks for everyone for being here. Rowan already thanked everyone who did the survey in the beginning, but I just want to kind of say that again because it was a really long survey, and there's so much good data in there that we wouldn't have without that time that you all took. So many thanks to you on that. It's definitely not a survey you'd want to do like hungry or before dinner or something like that. So what I'm going to be doing is kind of presenting so this slide, you can see it's called preliminary results, but then I've crossed out results because I just kind of want to do a data exploration right now. We haven't had all that much time to dig into the stories and kind of pull out, you know, comprehensive correlations and whatnot. But I just wanted to show the breadth of data about what people are doing on their forests right now, and kind of what they have in their forests, what kind of treatments are they doing, and I think that'll help inform other folks who are interested in harvesting their own lands. After I go through this brief data exploration, Seth is going to follow up with some case studies and kind of dig into one or two of these survey responses at a deeper level to kind of see those connections between harvesting and economics and all that good stuff. So I'd ask you to step aboard the blue cruise. The reason I say that is all my graphs are blue, and I didn't realize that the slides were also going to be blue. So we're going into Blue Town. So get your sea legs on and let's go. So the first thing I wanted to kind of jump into is total acres. So most of these graphs you'll see on the x-axis here is the variable that we're looking at, in this case, total acres. And then over here, you'll usually see the number of respondents within each of these bins. So looking at total acres, we'll see that the folks that responded generally had owned acres that were between 0 and 5,000. A couple in the 5,000 to 10,000 range, and then just a few, one even going up to 140,000 total acres. From there, you can look at treated acres. So of those total acres that these property owners had, how many did they treat in this harvest that they're reporting on? Again, kind of focusing on the 0 to 100 acres, but getting up into the 400 acre per harvest and 500 acre per harvest. And that's not to say that these were all harvested at the same time either. So they were also broken up into different harvest units. So even if you were harvesting 500 units, you may have been doing that with 12 different units or 6. So most of the time, this one here is 1. So these are the folks, about 40, that did one single harvest on all their acres. But everybody else did multiple harvests throughout their land. And this could be because of different starting conditions, different species types. There'd be various reasons why you'd want to do different types of harvests within the same property. Okay, so this kind of jumps into what Klaus was talking about. This is when we asked, what kind of harvest did you do? There's the clear cut. This is pretty typical harvest for Oregon, kind of what we're used to. About 15 participants also are doing an evenly spaced thin. So this is kind of not clear cutting, but thinning throughout at kind of a equal level. Selection is another popular one, and that's where you're selecting trees for a certain reason, whether they are, I don't know, if you're building a power line or whether they're unhealthy or something, but you're selecting trees to harvest specifically. We've got one shelter wood, which is slowly removing older trees in a way that leads to natural regeneration. But the big one that we have here is the one that Klaus kind of was doing an overview of, which is the variable density thin. So leaving gaps and different sort of spacing densities so that you have the variety that we're looking for with these kind of alternative harvesting methods. The other thing that always comes into play when thinking about harvesting is slope. A lot of folks had, you know, more gentle slopes, less than 30%. That's pretty typical. You start getting into the steeper slope classes when you're in the 30 to 50, and above 50 degrees, you're getting percent slope, you're getting pretty steep. And that's when you have to start using other harvesting methods that can be a little bit more expensive, using cables and whatnot. So it's an additional factor to take into consideration when planning your harvest. Standage. You might have heard Klaus mention once or twice that it really does matter what you're starting with as far as the trees that you have in your forest. So this gets at that a little bit. You know, younger trees, they're going to be less volume when you cut them, but you could also be encouraging the growth of older trees to come. 30 to 40 years, 40 to 60 years, and then 60 to 80 years and above 80, you're really in the old growth sort of bucket and looking at really large trees. But the largest majority of our respondents had kind of a mixed age, meaning there wasn't a single canopy layer. There's multiple ages within the same stands. And so, yeah, they're not all one age and you can't classify them as such. And just a side note, like I know I'm giving you guys a lot of different points and kind of one-offs as far as what the survey said. And as we move forward, I think it's going to be really interesting to tie these together a little bit more. So look forward to that. This is just kind of a teaser about, you know, what folks are doing right now and what's possible as far as harvesting and the different considerations to take into account. Okay, so presence of sensitive areas. Often you have to consider restrictions based on whether there's stream presence or no touch, which can be like cultural areas, buildings, roads, trails, nests of endangered birds specifically. And then very few of our respondents had none of these, but it kind of shows you that there's usually going to be something else to take into consideration when you're planning your harvest. Yeah. Well, I thought this one was interesting. So this is looking at, you know, trees can get damaged during a harvest. And so I thought it'd be interesting to see, based on what kind of harvest type you were doing, was there a harvest type that was more likely to cause damage than others? In this sample that we have, it does look like variable density thinning does cause a little bit more damage to the surrounding trees, at least in the cases that we had reported to us, which is interesting because, you know, you are moving around the forest and clearing out different gaps. You might expect that for selection thinning as well, but we didn't see that quite so much. Just something else, another factor to consider when choosing your harvest type. One of my favorites is slash treatment. I've always been a big fan. You know, once you cut your trees, you often have limbs and crowns that you have to figure out what to do with. So we asked how our property owners dealt with that. And we had a whole range of responses, from chipping them, maybe sending them off to the mill, masticating them, which is kind of cutting them up on the ground in the stand. Some folks did no slash treatment, depending on, you know, for various reasons. Pile and burn, piling them, and then sometimes just scattering the limbs throughout the stand. But the majority using a skid trail to take them out. And this has a big impact on fire, which is happening. It's happening these days. So, you know, dealing with these this fuel is important. It's no surprise that mostly what was harvested for the folks that responded to us was Doug fir. We're in Oregon and Washington, so that's no surprise. We had some big leaf maple, red alder, and some whitewoods, obviously a little bit of red cedar too, which kind of makes sense as far as like what our ecosystem look like as the forests around here. Haul distance. This one has come up quite a bit with people I talk to, because it really can make a difference on the economic feasibility of a harvest. Depending on how far away the nearest mill is, or the mill that accepts what material you're sending, can really make a difference as far as make or break. So, you know, there's a wide variety of haul distances from 0 to 70 miles. I imagine the 0, maybe they were processing on site, they have milling equipment, all the way to 70 miles, which would add some trucking costs to the overall harvest cost. So obviously, the more mills you have, the less this haul distance will be in general, but you have to have the volume just to stay in those mills as well. Just a couple more here. Volume by harvest type. So this is looking at the amount of volume that was taken out by each harvest type. Aptly titled. So, you know, clear cut isn't the most volume taken out, but this is not by acre. This is just in general. So this really depends on more than anything else, the size of the property, the number of acres you were harvesting. So I think one that shows it a little better is harvested volume per acre. And you can see here that while not as much as I would have thought, clear cut does have a higher volume removed from the stand per acre than any of the other alternative methods other than shelterwood, which is just one record here. Kind of hard to tell with a single record, but you can see that the median is not necessarily that much lower for these others, relatively. The mean diameter of the logs that are coming off of the stands tended to be bigger in the clear cut as well. Oh, I should say, just if you aren't familiar with box plots, that's what these are. So these boxes are showing you the median, which is this line in the middle here, the upper and lower quartiles, and then like the min and max. So it kind of shows you the range of values, with the majority falling within these boxes. So you can see that the majority of clear cuts had larger trees than the majority of variable density thins. The big one here is logging costs. So how do these different types of harvest relate to each other regarding the cost of logging? Surprisingly, they're pretty similar. You know, median costs are within, I guess that's when you start multiplying by millions of board feet, it does add up, but they're relatively in the same category of around $200 to $400 per NBFT. And the last one is the net income by harvest type. You'll notice that generally here, it's a positive net revenue. So for any of these different treatment types that you're doing, it made it penciled out. Not obviously, but you can make more money if you're cutting more trees. But you know, even if you don't cut them at the same time, you're leaving them for later. They're growing bigger, and you know, you're making your forests better. I'll leave my opinions out of it. But so yeah, you can just kind of see the differences in the net income per acre. But notice that they're all positive. And that's all the slides that I have for now. Like I said, I look forward to kind of pulling out more stories and, you know, tying these things together a little bit. But right now I'm going to pass it over to Seth, who's going to dig in a little bit more into these, into a couple case studies and show us what a single harvest can look like.
All right, well, thanks so much, Sarah, for that introduction to what we've found in this survey. And like both Sarah and Klaus were saying, we haven't had a chance yet to do any statistical analysis. And so what we thought might be useful to start with is to take a complementary perspective and drill down into a few of these cases. And so I'm going to look at 3 different harvests as a way of peering behind the curtain at what these harvests were like for the landowners and the forest. And I know there's a saying, right, that the plural of anecdote is not data. So this obviously has no statistical relevance, but I've tried to choose 3 harvests that might be relevant in particular to the community forestry coalition and to the kinds of forests that might be managed by people who are establishing community forests. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Pardon me while I go through the necessary clicks to make that happen.
Well, that actually gives me a chance to insert a response. Susan asked about who we sent the survey to and the types of landowners in the sample. So in response to your question, Susan, yes, we reached out to landowners, particularly family forest landowners in Western Washington and Western Oregon, to see if they had harvests within the last 5 years. And we received, of the responses that we would consider complete, we received 78 that we're including in the data analysis.
All right. What nice dovetailing. Thank you. So I'm going to run through this first case study, and it comes to us from a landowner in the Oregon Coast Range who owns between 60 and 100 acres. And you'll notice I'm being kind of cagey about the particulars, and that's because one of the promises we made to the respondents to the survey was that we were going to keep their responses utterly confidential and not traceable back to them. And so rather than telling you how many acres and what county, and you know, the more curious among you might go and try to dox them, I'm not going to do that and just leave it kind of vague. And one of the things we asked the landowners was, what are your long-term goals for the property? And this forest owner told us that they were interested in harvesting timber, having a yield of timber over time, enhancing their forest habitat, and generating some income. And in the short term, as they were considering this specific harvest, they wanted to improve the health of their stand, generate some cash income, and reduce fire hazard. So this is how they started off. This harvest unit, which is about, you know, give or take about half of their holdings, was in 30 to 40-year-old forest, almost all of it Douglas fir, all in one canopy layer, and pretty dense, as you'll see, 10 to 12-foot spacing by their report, and holding about 25,000 board feet to the acre. One advantage they had, the slopes were, as we saw in one of Sarah's slides, most of these harvests were on relatively gentle ground, and this was no exception. So they went in and they took about 1 truckload of logs per acre, a total of 175,000 board feet, most of it small peelers, and then some chip and saw, a little bit of pulp, and earned over $100,000 in gross revenue, amounting to $3,200 per acre. So here on this plot, you'll see they're represented by the red dot there, and you can see where they stack up in the range of these other results. I want to thank Sarah for putting these graphs together. Quite a wizard with all of the data display. So there they are, you know, a pretty good harvest among harvests within their age class. We all know, of course, that the net income is going to be less than the gross revenue. And so they wound up spending, as is relatively common, about half the gross revenue on logging costs, had to do a little bit of road work, and they netted over $50,000, or about $1,500 per acre. Now, I just want to pause as we're looking at this and point out these outliers here. These high these cases with high net income per acre, those are almost all of them clear cuts. One of them is a 2-acre selection cut, and not really comparable to the rest of the harvests that we're looking at. And a clear cut, really, you're in a clear cut, you're liquidating your productive asset, and not your soil, of course, but the growing stock. And so just like you wouldn't look at a rancher's result and say, well, let's compare this rancher who sold off all of their breeding ewes along with their lambs to the ones who just sold their lamb crop from the year. Or you wouldn't compare the results that an investor in the stock market got who'd sold off their blue chip stocks versus just banked the dividends. We can't really include those. We have to just think about them separately from the rest of these points down here that are not clear cuts. So a little over $50,000, nothing to sneeze at. And let's look at what we know about why. There were some factors that were favorable and some that were not so favorable, just like you'll often find in the real world. The long skidding distance, you'll see that they had to endure because the road network, I guess, was probably pretty sparse, meant that their logging costs were relatively high. On the other hand, a relatively high fraction, as we saw, of what they pulled out were veneer logs, and small fraction were pulp, and so that made things a little bit better for them. So that's sort of a mid-range case. The next case I want to look at comes to us from Northwest Washington, from a mid-sized landowner. And this is a landowner whose holdings, at least the harvest unit that they told us about, was maybe a little bit more comparable to what an organization acquiring a community forest from an industrial owner, a plantation that was fairly young and just coming into productivity, might be able to expect to acquire. So this owner's long-term goals was to harvest timber over time, increase the resilience to climate change, and store more carbon, all laudable goals. And in the short term, they wanted to improve the health of their stand and get some cash income. The forest they were starting with, these 400 acres, was under 30 years old, almost all Douglas fir. And you'll see that the spacing was relatively sparse, right? 15 to 20 feet instead of the 10 to 12 foot spacing in the last case. That suggests that the forest was probably pre-commercially thinned, which helped set it up for faster growth. Not very much volume per acre by comparison, and again, the benefit of gentle slopes. What they had going for them was, it's a pretty big harvest unit, so they had some economies of scale. They managed to reap $500,000 in gross revenue. Half of what they pulled out were saw logs and half pulp, and they made gross $1,250 an acre, again taking out about 1 truckload to the acre. By comparison, here's the dot from before. We're down in the younger age class with lower gross income per acre. But of course, then there's costs. And you'll see here that the logging costs were more than 2/3 of the gross. There was also some road cost, and so they wound up with just $230 per acre from that harvest. Now that's That's obviously better than a sharp stick in the eye. And the thing to consider here is that an early harvest like this, what we're seeing, it can be used to fund the necessary forest improvement. You know, this $50,000 in investment in road infrastructure is something that hopefully they'll be able to use over repeated harvests over the subsequent harvest entries 10, 15 years down the line and on into the future. And then there, so here we are in this little blue dot, just barely above zero, but better above than below. And you can see here, when we look at it in the context of what percentage of their harvest was saw timber versus pulp, you can see, right, a trend here where the returns, the net returns per acre are lower, the less saw timber and more pulp you have. So there they are, just barely above water. And I think what this points out is that it's really key to undertake a harvest like this if you don't want to have to put money into the forest, to rely on your forester to help you figure out how soon you can do this so that it'll actually land you in the black. The other thing they had going for them compared to the last harvest was a slightly shorter skidding distance. And so again, imagine if you can see sort of a trend line here, if the skidding distance were higher, then this blue dot would be down below zero, and you'd be having to put money in to make this harvest work. So I don't want to leave on such a glum note, so I thought that it'd be worth looking at a third case that comes to us from a landowner in Western Washington with several thousand acres. Their long-term goals, equally laudable, making the forest more resilient to climate change, improving the habitat to promote biodiversity and generating income, and then immediately restoring ecosystem services and ecological benefits, improving the health of the stand, and along the way, receiving some cash income. What they had to work with was a better endowment of forest and timber inventory. They had 48 acres in this harvest unit, a 40 to 60-year-old forest, already in a couple of canopy layers with multiple species. So they already had a jump on their the heterogeneity goals. It was already a bit more spaced out, and they had about 30,000 board feet to the acre, again on gentle slopes. And so with that, they were able to thin the forest, and this was another one of those variable density thins, taking out more than 2 truckloads of logs to the acre, just under a little under 400,000 board feet plus 350 tons of pulp. You'll see again a favorable ratio of saw logs to pulp, $250,000 in gross revenue, and here we are on the green dot compared to the first case in red and the second case in blue, that we're already we're definitely higher up on the scale of gross income to the acre. Even after accounting for logging costs, we're looking at which were about half of the cost. They netted $160,000, give or take, which is, that's, you can actually, that's at least from my point of view for a forest owner, that's real money. And they were benefiting, of course, from the fact that they had relatively higher quality logs because it was a slightly older stand and a high proportion of saw timber in their harvest. The other advantage they were looking at was skidding distance, which was relatively low. There was a good road network apparently in their harvest unit. And so they were able to, they didn't, that kept the logging costs down. So what are the key takeaways then as we look back at these three cases? And I'd say the first one is, yes, thinning is not, it's not simply, I don't know, hippie forestry. It's not forestry just for those who are playing around. This it actually is a financially viable and even an attractive proposition. At the same time, the returns are going to be affected by some very site-specific factors to both the site that you're working on, the age of the stand, the size of the trees, species, quality of the logs, the skidding distance, hauling distances, and then others that relate to the external factors. What's the availability of markets in your area? What are they paying? How far are you going to have to haul those logs to get them to market? If the stands are under 30, just give or take, and obviously it's going to depend on site-specific factors, don't count on a lot of luscious financial returns, but if you time it right, you should be able to get the thinning that you do to pay for necessary improvements to the forest. And so overall, ecological forestry, which are the harvests that I personally and we at NNRG are more interested in understanding better, what we're learning is that ecological forestry is a get-rich-slow proposition, and not a bad thing if you can be patient and wait for the forest to grow up. So with that, those are the three cases I wanted to present. Thank you very much for following along with this and sticking with this format of distance learning and Zoom, which we all have spent so much time on in the last 6 or 7 months. Please do keep in touch with us, and you can follow along to this URL where we will be posting updates as we have results to release. So I'll turn it back over to Rowan now to moderate a Q&A part.
Yeah, and thanks, Seth. Your last point actually got to one of the questions. So in terms of a written report, we are, of course, still in the process of analyzing the data, but we are going to be putting together several different products from the data that we get. We're hoping to have one that's more research-based, one that's more oriented towards family landowners, so that family landowners can find a profile that's somewhat similar to theirs, and see what some of the outcomes of their harvest might be. And we'll also be putting together some videos and having some other presentations with a more advanced version of the data analysis in the spring. So definitely a lot more to come with this. And as Seth mentioned, that link on the bottom of this page will take you to what right now is the study itself and the questions that we asked, but over time we're going to continue to evolve that page and have the most updated information available through that URL. So feel free to keep in touch there, and also for those of you who are on the NNRG listserv, we'll be sending out results and giving updates through our monthly newsletters as well. So you can check it out there as well. We did have 2 questions come in, one from Ben, probably directed at Seth. For the non-foresters, can you clarify the point about saw timber and describe age and diameter relationship?
Sure. Different mills have different minimum diameter requirements, and they're looking usually at the size of the small end of the log, because of course logs taper from the base of the tree up towards the top. And below about 5 or 6 inches at the top, at the small end, you'd be hard pressed to find a mill that would take that to turn it into 2x4s or to peel it for veneer. So those smaller trees, then the only market for them is pulp. And nothing wrong with pulp. We all use paper, but it's a lower value product, and it's in fact such low value that typically a logger will just agree to clear it off the land in exchange for what they can get for it at the pulp mill. And so it doesn't typically contribute to the landowner's net income from the harvest. In terms of diameter. In terms of age, if in a first entry thinning, say at anywhere between 25 and 30 years old here on the west side, you might be looking at half or even 2/3 of the harvest going to pulp, and the remainder going to saw timber. And then as you get up to into the mid 30s in terms of age, say 35 or 40, then that ratio would flip, and you'd have the vast majority being saw timber or veneer. Now, there's always going to be the top part of the tree that is the tiniest, and where you're always going to have some pulpwood. So it's good to have a market for that, even if you're cutting a larger diameter classes.
Great, and we also have.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, I'm guessing that by now everyone has written all this down, so I'm going to stop the screen share, and feel free to, if you need, maybe we can put the URL in the chat or something.
It looks like Sustainable Northwest already put up the URL, so you can go to that. And as I mentioned, we'll continue updating that as we come out with different resources that we create from the results. We also had a question from Jean. If you did the same survey on the east side, how would the results differ? Seth, do you want to take that one as well? It's a big question.
It is. I wish Klaus were here, but I'll do my best. I'd say, the east side is not blessed with the same competitive mill environment that we have on the west side. So the price of logs is lower, the density of trees is lower, and the productivity of soils is lower. What can I say? The rainforest is just a great place to grow trees, and the east side is not that. All that being said, so it would then take, the trees would probably have to be older before you'd get this, before the net return per acre would increase. I really only want to speak in qualitative terms about that. As Ben Franklin said, better to keep your mouth shut and be thought a fool than to open it and remove all doubt.
Always good to keep some questions in people's minds. And that also reminds me that, if there are particular types of data that are useful from this process, as we're still in the process of analyzing the data, if there are specific things that would be useful to any of you, you're welcome to reach out to us at any time and mention it, and we'll see if we can either get you that information or if we can integrate that into some of the information that we're putting out, because of course we do want this to be useful for everyone. So as I mentioned, we are putting together several different types of resources, but if you have ideas for that, just let us know. We also had a comment from Michael. In ecological forestry, we often think of managing for very old forest conditions. In more conventional forestry, we justify our expenses and forest entries based on that big payday with a clear cut at the end. Is there a middle ground, like doing ecological forestry on a longer rotation and then clear cut what we have in year 60 to 100?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
You stated it very well.
In fact, we don't have a lot of examples here of people who are harvesting in older stands. Probably because of the legacy of how, what the management history has been here on the west side in recent decades. But absolutely, I would hope that, if we were doing this study 20 years from now, we'd have a lot of examples of people continuing to thin on into, the 60, 70, 80 years old. I mean, these trees, there's obviously a lot of reasons besides just timber productivity to decide when to harvest, but you could, and it certainly doesn't take a 20-acre clear cut to have enough light to regenerate even a shade intolerant species. I think Klaus was talking about the results they were getting with 1-acre gaps, so there's no reason you couldn't keep on going, and then at age 70 or 80 start putting some smaller gaps in there and get a second younger cohorts going, and continue this model of harvesting the dividends that the forest is providing instead of just having that one, as Michael says, big payday at the end.
Yeah, and that's something it can be a bit hard to pull out from the data, but more anecdotally and on a case study basis, we have seen and heard from different landowners about their long-term experience with management and doing exactly that. So especially some of the family farms that have been in the same family for 100, 120 years, where they've actually had that amount of time to manage over the long term. There have been some families that are thinking in the long term and kind of taking off, as we were talking about as a metaphor, taking off the dividends rather than selling all the stocks. So, and they've shared some pretty impressive results with us that, again, we're hoping that we can show at least some of that through the data and put together a profile that matches that with some of the anonymized data. Are there any other questions that folks have? We're certainly always available over email if people do have questions. But if not, we're happy to wrap up. All right. Well, I think in that case, we can go ahead and wrap up. And thank you all again for joining us and listening to us. Yes, Seth.
Actually, I just wanted to put in a plug for a listserv that NNRG has just started. It's the Pacific Northwest Ecological Forestry listserv. And it's a place where people can throw out questions like these and kick around ideas. And I'm hoping, that maybe we can put a link to that in the chat here before we close. Yes, thank you, Rowan. So you're all invited. It's an open Google group, and you can choose to either get emails as a listserv or just visit on the web and check into the conversations as they're unfolding there.
Yeah, especially during these times when we can't have as many conversations in person. It's nice to have some kind of platform to chat with folks and get people's opinions on ecological forestry in this case.
Right on. Ben, is there anything you want to add by way of closing as our host?
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. Those were wonderful presentations. And really looking forward to continuing the conversation. For those of you that are interested, tomorrow we have a 9 a.m. panel on recreation and balancing what you've just heard. So it's balancing silviculture and forest operations with recreation planning. So that should be fun as well. Thank you so much for joining the panel, and thank you for sharing your contact information. I sincerely hope we can get together in person soon and take a walk in the woods.
Absolutely.